webinar is the third in a 4-part series that we're doing of Rancher Roundtables in January and February. And it's a partnership between the Madison Valley Ranchlands Group, MSU Extension, the Ruby Valley Conservation District, as well as the Madison Conservation District. So the last program that we have after this one is 2 weeks from today, and that's going to be on February 23rd, and the topic is grazing to improve soil health. So be sure to come back in with the same link if you're interested in that topic. In terms of housekeeping, as you join, for those who haven't been on before the last couple of ones, please keep your video off and your microphone muted. David with the Madison Conservation District can help with some of the tech piece and can help mute folks if they come unmuted. But we're going to have 3 speakers tonight. We're going to have 2 live speakers here with us, and we're going to play a video from a 3rd speaker. And we'll just let you guys know that you can use the chat box throughout the hour and a half while the speakers are presenting, and I'll be monitoring that chat box with your questions and send them over to the speakers to be answered as they go along. And we'll also leave some time at the end for Q&A, so you can count on that. So one other thing I'll say is that we will have an evaluation at the end of this, as we've had with the last couple, and I'll put that link to the evaluation in the chat box. And our previous 2 talks on backcountry first aid and then also calving, we have those recorded and on YouTube. So if you want a link to those presentations, let us know in the chat and we'll share it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker of the night on our Grasshopper integrated pest management technique talk for the evening. And so I'm going to give a brief bio for our first speaker, who is Dave Branson. He is a research entomologist with the USDA Ag Research Service out in Sidney, Montana. And Dave Branson has studied grasshopper management and ecology for over 25 years, working for USDA Agriculture Research Service in Sidney, Montana for the past 22 years after receiving his PhD at Utah State University. His grasshopper research has focused on a wide range of topics, including examining rangeland management practices that can reduce grasshopper outbreaks, the impact of grasshoppers on rangeland production and function, and the role of drought in grasshopper outbreaks. He's going to talk tonight about topics that include weather and food as drivers of grasshopper outbreaks, the impacts of grasshoppers on rangeland production, and the cultural management practices to reduce grasshopper problems. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dave to get us started for the evening.
Thanks, Kalina. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for joining in. About a year ago, Kalina asked if I would give a presentation. Obviously, that one sort of didn't happen due to the early days of COVID that we still find ourselves in. So this photo here on the title slide, I just put it there to remind us that, at times maybe things could be a little bit worse. We have a major outbreak going in Montana, but this is a photo from the desert locust outbreak that's going on it actually spans from Eastern Africa all the way over to India and Pakistan and all in between. It's in the US, we had a locust species, but it went extinct at around 1910. So we're sort of lucky in that regard. So obviously people are pretty aware, at least in big parts of Montana, we're sort of in, you get in these regional cyclical outbreaks that happen periodically. People used to say every 12 years on average. And during those outbreaks, if we look at Montana, we might have 100-ish species. There's some strange species up in the mountains, of which maybe 80 or so are on rangeland species. But our outbreaks are typically driven by a pretty small subset of those species. Just a handful are causing a lot of the problems. Obviously, during dry periods, is when, as you can see in this photo, where grasshoppers are, grass production is low, and obviously you're getting competition between livestock and grasshoppers for forage. Or during the severe outbreaks, it doesn't really matter whether it's dry or not, like we saw in big parts of Montana last summer. Rangeland forage losses from grasshoppers are estimated roughly at about $1.7 billion per year in central and western US. Some of this isn't bad. They help turn nutrients over, but obviously the outbreaks, the wide-scale outbreaks, lead to a lot of problems and the need for chemical control. So stay tuned for Gary's talk after me, because he'll be delving into those topics. So if we think about grasshoppers, they're pretty small, but if we look at the upper right here and we think, okay, grasshopper versus cows. And if we weighed the grasshoppers, oh, Gary says my slides are not advancing. Is that true? Kalina?
I can see your slides advance.
Okay, so you see grasshopper feeding impacts. Gary texted me, and so I was briefly worried. So if we think about the grasshoppers on a per acre basis, when they're abundant, as they are in a lot of Montana right now, they would actually weigh more than cows and wildlife on that given acre of land in many cases. And they're going to be removing more of the plant biomass than cows and wildlife combined. So they can really have a big impact on what's going on. They're an important food source for birds, so they do have some positive aspects. This is perhaps not the typical thing that's eating grasshoppers, but a cool photo from a photographer. And they can affect nutrient cycling, but we don't know a lot about how often, they actually can have some small positive impacts. But they are a dominant herbivore out there on grasslands, and as a result, they have a big impact. As I said, there's usually only a few species that are dominant at a site. We might have 5 to 20 species in a given location. If you went out in a 40-acre area, we might find 20 species perhaps. And the plant community that's present has a big part in determining which grasshopper species of those, say, 100 that we find in the state are going to be present at a given site. There's only one generation per year. The ones that we're concerned about lay eggs in the soil, hatch in spring and early summer. And this poor quality photo of a grasshopper nymph with snow is just to remind me that, I will get questions about, well, it's March. Are we going to have a lot of grasshopper problems? Because I saw a grasshopper. We do have about 5 species in the state that overwinter as immature grasshoppers. They hatch in late summer, and they're adults by April or May. These usually are not, they're usually not any kind of an economic problem, but they can make people concerned when you see a grasshopper in early spring when you're not expecting it. Here's sort of an overview of the life cycle of a grasshopper. They hatch, they're pretty small, which is why when Gary's going to talk, if you're looking for grasshopper problems, you really have to be paying attention to small, you got to be looking for things that are about the size of a leafhopper when they hatch. They're pretty small. And a lot of times ranchers may not notice they have problems until they're large or, large and moving to adults. And especially if you're feeling that you need to do some control efforts, you probably missed your window and lost a lot of that forage. A lot can hatch, and a lot of the deaths can occur in this area as well. But they go through about 5 stages. It varies depending on how warm it is as to how long that takes. And they molt into adults, mate, lay eggs, and the adults can hang around for a while, depending on what the weather patterns are. And then, of course, you have the egg pods, which is how they're overwintering. So as I say, the main point here is just when we're thinking about this life cycle, it's you really want to be paying attention to these early stages of grasshoppers, especially in terms of any control effort decisions that might be going on. There's 3 groups of grasshoppers we have, 3 different subfamilies. We have the banded wing grasshoppers. These are pretty evident when you see them because they have colored wings when they're flying around. The ones with colored wings aren't really pest species. They're really evident. A lot of them snap and make a clicking sound as they fly. But if they have colored wings, they're really not a pest. There is one grasshopper in this group of banded wing grasshoppers that actually has clear wings, and its common name is the clear winged grasshopper. And as Gary will point out later, this is a pest species, Camnula pellucida, that's common in your area. You can sort of, and you know, it sort of has, the adults have a sort of a distinctive little pattern on the top of their wings. We also have spur-throated grasshoppers because they have a little spur just sort of, you know, where, you know, between their front legs is, and these include a lot of pest species. The migratory grasshopper, that's really a big problem in the current Montana outbreak. And they're diverse. It includes crop and rangeland pest species. Some mix between, like the migratory grasshopper can be a pest in both those settings. And I said they're often nondescript. A lot of times the adults just look sort of like, oh, it's a brownish grasshopper, nothing too exciting or dramatic, but they're one of our big pests. The slant-faced grasshopper group, some of them are really extreme slant-faced, like this species that isn't extremely common. They pretty much just eat grass. So the only reason I point that out is at times, you know, if you have crops next to rangeland, if it was dominated by slant-faced species, you know, your crop might or might not be at risk depending on what you were growing. This species over here on the right is also common in your area. It's called the white-eared grasshopper, and that's a common slant-faced species. You can see it doesn't, you know, have an extreme slant face. So some of these groupings are, you know, not always perfect in terms of a common name. The males in this group sort of make a sound, which we'd call sort of singing. It's little pegs on their legs when they're trying to attract females. And grasshoppers can be pretty hard to identify. This is just to show 3 fifth instar nymphs, or immature grasshoppers of the same species, to show that you can get pretty different colors of these nymphs. We have a website at the lab here in Sydney. I'll put it up again at the end. It has some identification apps. Some of them I'll mention in here, but because species differ in what they eat, knowing what species is present can really help you decide what risk you're at, particularly, as I say, if you're looking at crop areas next to rangeland. Some species are probably a bit beneficial. Here's a species that's never common enough to serve as a weed control agent, but you'll see that it eats kochia, Russian thistle, greasewood, plants like that. It'll actually starve to death if it's combined with grass only. You know, some of these could be beneficial, but as I say, they're not the problems that we're focused on during these outbreak periods, these specialist grasshoppers. There's a range of the specialist ones, but most of the ones that are typically our pests that we're concerned about are either generalists that eat both grasses and flowering plants, or ones that just eat a wide range of grasses. You can get a USDA. There's a identification app that's available for both iPhone and Android phones. Just search for grasshoppers of the Western US. It's available with both an adult and a nymphal key. And I'll show you the computer version on the next slide to show it's really not that hard. You don't need a lot of knowledge. You know, it's a key where you choose features and it narrows down the species. So here you can see by choosing 2 features, I've discarded 75 species and I have 8 species remaining. When you have to choose a feature, you can click on it. It'll show you a photo of what that is. This also works on your smartphone as well. So it can be useful in terms of trying to see what your problems are. And as I say, it's free, you know, produced by USDA. So it'd be great to see it being used. There's lots of things that eat grasshoppers. Birds, as I mentioned, you know, they're a primary food source. Birds and spiders can help regulate grasshopper populations when densities are low, but obviously during these outbreak periods, grasshoppers have sort of escaped the effects of robber flies, spiders, and birds. There's a lot of diseases and parasites. We don't always have a great understanding of those. You may, at times, especially if you get a little higher in the mountains where it's a little more humidity, you'll see this summit disease sometimes where the grasshopper is dead, but it looks like they're holding on for dear life on the vegetation. As I say, they're grasshoppers and other insects can play an important role. When they're at lower densities, for example, sage-grouse chicks are pretty dependent on insects in general during the first couple of weeks of life. A lot of songbirds, are also relying on them. But obviously, some of the densities we were seeing last year, you're probably not going to end up with any remaining forage for those birds during the rest of their life cycle. So I thought I'd talk a decent amount about grasshoppers and weather, because that's one of the most common questions I get, is often, well, it's dry, this is bad for grasshoppers. And, my answer a lot of times is, well, it depends, which no one likes answers like that. But we're still not perfect in our ability to predict how grasshoppers respond to weather variation. And also forage quality. I mean, these are like many cows out there. So the forage quality has a big impact on what's happening with grasshoppers as well. There's a lot of variation if we look across the Western US. Tall grass prairie responds a lot differently. Intermountain West responds differently. In the Northern Great Plains, we always, the rule of thumb has always been, well, population increases with warm, dry conditions. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There's a lot we don't know, and our ability to predict is still pretty weak. At our lab in Sydney, we just hired a insect pest forecaster whose primary focus is developing better predictions for grasshoppers in the Western US. He's a pretty sharp modeler guy, so I think we're going to be able to make some advances and give people better predictions so they can be prepared for problems a little further in advance instead of just realizing, oh, they have a huge problem. So if we think about rule of thumb with regard to weather, if we think about sort of a summer where it's maybe cloudy and rainy, these would typically be a little less damaging. It slows development because insects obviously need sun and warmth to grow. They're possibly more susceptible to disease and natural enemies. We don't know how much in many cases. Typically, you're going to see more of them die from the time they hatch before they become adults, and you end up with fewer eggs laid because they need that warmth from the sun. And as long as you're not in the middle of a severe outbreak, you're also getting higher forage production. So there's times when a rancher will say, oh, I don't really have many grasshoppers, and it's a wet year when you've had a lot of forage production. It's like, yeah, you do have a lot of grasshoppers, but you're not really noticing them because there's plenty of food to go around between the cows and the hoppers. During the sunny, warmer periods, obviously we think about more damaging, faster development, and the larger they get, the more they're going to eat, less susceptible to diseases. And as long as you have quality forage, they're going to be able to produce more eggs. And we'll talk a little bit more about forage quality later on in terms of viewing risk on your land. One question that I've gotten this winter is, well, what's the effect of this severe drought, at least that, we see in a lot of the Western US? And also, people wonder about when it gets cold, like it's currently right now, what happens? Grasshopper eggs can handle pretty cold temperatures. We've done some lab work, and they're below ground. But you can get mortality if you have really cold temperatures without snow cover. So at times that can happen. It's pretty rare. The effect of these really low soil moisture content heading into winter, we know they need little blips of moisture. We don't have a really good understanding in terms of predicting how that affects grasshopper problems. We're starting some new research on that will tie into the models and hopefully lead to some better predictions on that front. I thought I'd go through a couple examples of grasshoppers and weather, just to sort of talk about what do we see when different patterns happen. And looking at 2010, where this is a point forecast, red just means you have high numbers of grasshoppers. So you can see in a big part of the central western US, there were some severe grasshopper problems. And a lot of outbreak densities in Montana, as you see on the right. And so we headed into 2011, and it was a wet early summer, which people often ask, well, isn't that going to kill all the grasshoppers? There's a couple things to keep in mind. In the case of 2011, most grasshoppers hadn't hatched yet. It was sort of a record late hatch. So what cold conditions? Are they good for young grasshoppers? No. But if they haven't hatched yet, it's not really having any impact at all. And the other thing is that it does take pretty severe conditions to directly kill them. If you have sustained wet cold, that's bad. They can starve to death, get disease. But if it's just a little blip, it may not matter as much. Obviously, if you get an overland flow of water, that's going to wipe them all out. If you have a slow summer, it reduces the time for egg laying, but it sort of depends on that forage quality in terms of, are they able to lay eggs? And this is just a view of a grasshopper ovary that you can sort of look at to see what's going on with egg production. So in 2012, obviously I'm based in Eastern Montana. I do a lot of research in Miles City at the ARS Fort Keogh station there. And in 2012, there was a severe drought in sort of southeast Montana, where in Miles City, there were a high number of hatchlings, but not many survived to adults because plant forage quality was very low and there wasn't much plant biomass. So grasshoppers may like it dry, but they need to have some protein content. They need to have a little bit of green vegetation to survive and lay eggs. So as a result, populations basically cratered, resulting from limited food. And as a result of that limited food, not much egg laying took place. We sort of see similar patterns when we've done some cage experiments. This is just sort of an example from Fort Keogh, where we were doing some experiments, which we're not going to worry about all the bar graphs and data too much, other than to show there were pretty high densities at that site in general. We had about, these are all per meter squared there, but 25 to 30 per meter squared. And then late summer and fall, you get into September, densities sort of typically decline. But there was a lot of late summer rain, which in Eastern Montana is quite rare. And actually forage quality increased in late summer. So as I say, we had about 25 grasshoppers per square meter, but we had a large late summer rain event, which led to green up of grass, and we had a lot of reproduction that took place. So in the following year, I'll just point out this graph on the upper left, which shows that rainfall event, which resulted in good food and allowed a lot of egg production for our late season species, led to a severe outbreak of around 130 grasshoppers per square meter due to that combination of high quality food during the egg laying phase. Now you'll see they rapidly ate everything that was there. They pretty much ate the grass down to bare ground, and the populations crashed because there was no available food. And this limited survival and low reproduction, as we saw with the large scale data, led to densities declining by 85% in the following year. and actually densities of the common late season species that drove the outbreak in 2000 dropped by about 97% in the following year. They were about 100 per meter squared of that one species in 2000, and that dropped to 3 per meter squared in 2001. So I'm just want to point out, if you're a rancher and you're looking at your forage, that, as I say, grasshoppers are dependent on that, and severe outbreaks can end rapidly if there isn't enough quality food available for them. And we can't always predict these effects of forage and weather from the surveys that USDA does, but people on the ground are already watching these factors, and they can help you assess what your risk is. Where are things headed? These are some maps produced by Gary's group. Just to show sort of the lead up to where we are now, these are maps created when it says a hazard for 18. It's basically a map of the densities in the previous year in 2017. Red, once again, a higher risk. These sort of undervalue small little hotspots. So they're not always perfect, because if you have a small hotspot, it may not show up on these maps. But it generally shows that 18 pretty mellow, a little more in terms of orange and red, higher densities in 2019. Risk, which would be the densities in 2018. We see what took place in 2019, an increase throughout sort of a fairly wide area, but still nothing too crazy over here in southeast Montana. And then if we look at what happened last year, if we look at these point survey data, we see red throughout large parts of the state. And also, in terms of the map that's been smoothed, once again, showing a very high risk. As I say, it's not perfect just relying on these maps to predict risk for the following year. And that's where ARS and APHIS are both working to sort of, combine satellite vegetation and weather data so we can better predict what is going to happen. But basically, pretty high risk for most of the state in this following year. And Gary is going to be, and his crew are going to be insanely busy, sadly, most likely. One quick example from Miles City, where we have our long-term sites. So, in eastern Montana, we had a really dry year, but we had such extreme rainfall in late summer and fall of 2019 that forage quality actually remained fairly high through a big chunk of the summer. It was a little bit warmer than the previous year as well. And, if you think about risk, especially related to grasshopper reproduction, it's pretty much thinking about what were your grasshopper densities combined with what were the forage conditions and temperature in late summer, because that's that window when grasshoppers are going to be laying egg pods. And if we look in the upper right at some of our sites there at Fort Keogh, we still had 20 grasshoppers per square meter in late August, meaning that's when they're laying eggs and densities remained high. We also dissected some grasshoppers to look at their reproduction, and over 90% of the females had laid more than one, at least, or more than one egg pod by mid-September. And a high percentage of the egg pods can vary in size, but basically a lot of them were producing egg, which tells us the forage quality was good. So if forage conditions were similar to Fort Keogh and other places where forage quality remained okay into August and September, at Fort Keogh, we predict, it was pretty high densities, 30 to 40 per square meter, but we would expect that conditions would be a lot worse next year because of that forage quality when they were laying eggs, and the fact that it does look like a lot of eggs went in the ground. The caveat, of course, we don't have a good understanding of how the super dry soil moisture might or might not lead to some egg mortality there. So if we think about risk assessment, there's some things that I think people on the land can think about if you've had high grasshopper numbers and you're thinking about, are those problems likely to continue? I've mentioned repeatedly the idea of looking at that late summer forage condition. Grasshoppers like it reasonably dry and sunny, but as I've said, they need protein. They need some green vegetation. They don't need a lot of moisture, but if it's completely brown and senesced, they're not really gonna do very well. The second thing is, because they're laying eggs in late summer, did the densities, if you have really high densities early summer and then they crash because everything got dry, that probably gives you a pretty good indication your risk is going to be a lot lower in the following year. And then also looking at those late summer and fall weather conditions. Is it warm versus cool? Insects need heat. So, to lay many eggs, you're going to need those warmer conditions. They may stay alive if it's cool, and the densities may stay there, but there's going to be less egg laying because they need heat to end up producing those eggs. And Gary will touch on this too, but if you have areas with high summer densities, that's where you really want to be paying attention for hatching. And you really need to look when they're small. I mean, as I say, they're the size of leafhoppers basically when they hatch. So you really at times got to get down there and see, are you seeing leafhoppers? Are you seeing grasshoppers? To sort of see what your risk is. And Gary will touch into all that more. So I'll just briefly, in wrapping up, mention a few areas that we've done research on here in Sydney. One is trying to use some cage-based studies where we manipulate precipitation to get a better idea how, everyone says dry is good for grasshoppers, but we're trying to manipulate the conditions so we can get a better idea of what's the range where, say, drier conditions are good versus bad for grasshoppers to allow us to better predict risk as we move forward. So we've done a couple different experiments, a few different, but I'm not going to go into the details other than saying that, in a simple experiment where we just sort of had a moderate drought versus no drought, we use these passive drought frames that are used a lot in range studies these days that sort of run water off from part of the cage. And a moderate drought reduced reproduction in a year when we had pretty low early summer rain, but high late summer rain, but we didn't see a lot of effects on survival. So, a bit of a small negative influence, but obviously drought often is a seasonal thing. And so we followed that up by looking at sort of early versus late drought. And actually we found that drought timing mattered. And here we see what we might expect, which was early summer drought. So we sort of created a drought in early summer, then we took off those drought frames and let it be normal rain. So we see that early summer drought actually positively, it reduced the biomass, but it positively affected the nitrogen content of the grass because you had less being produced. And it also led to higher grasshopper survival. So, but in general, it looks like you need fairly extreme drought to strongly negatively affect grasshoppers. I mean, they're fairly well adapted to these semi-arid systems. And another question that we get, which we're doing a bit more research on moving forward, is when you have high grasshopper numbers, does that really damage your rangeland longer term? And we've done a little bit of research on this, and with grass feeding grasshoppers seem to create more problems for rangeland. They have a stronger effect than these mixed feeding species. With the migratory grasshopper, which is common in the outbreaks going on right now. And we sort of maintain densities at up to 45 grasshoppers per square meter for 5 summers. And at the end of those 5 years, we don't really see a strong effect on grass species composition in this grass-dominated site or on production the following year. So the good news is that, at least with a species that has a little weaker effect, that we're not seeing huge long-term effects. But obviously, during these severe outbreaks, when they're taking it down to bare ground, could be a different matter. Another area that we've done research in, as Kalina said in the intro, is looking at, can we manage rangeland differently to reduce risk? And the answer is it's a bit complex. And part of this is driven by, rangeland is sort of a renewable system. And we're trying to see, if we could change the focus to try and prevent grasshopper outbreaks by managing land differently to sort of slow growth, reduce survival or reproduction of grasshoppers. Here's a study that was done by my predecessor where you can see two different types of grazing. This is sort of grasshopper days. Think of it as grasshopper densities, where we see very large differences during an outbreak period between those two different forms of grazing. This twice over grazing was less predictable. The hypothesis that didn't always have the greatest vegetation data is that you ended up with more ground cover, which would also be worse for grasshoppers. So sort of the inconsistent pattern of timing between years and a little more ground cover was the hypothesis, leading to slower development and less reproduction. But because grasshoppers fluctuate over time, it's not always clear cut. This is just from a follow-up study we did where densities were low. This was sort of ideal during an outbreak because we see this big difference. During low densities, we might not see an effect of different types of land management. We've also done quite a bit of work with fire at Miles City with a range fire scientist there. And fire can reduce densities of some grasshopper species by over 80%. But the effects depend on the species of grasshopper, fire timing, and how much biomass you have. We did an experiment. We burned in a couple different years, so we did it a couple times. This shows the overall densities, unburned versus burned. And you can see we had effects persist for a couple years. Of a couple of these species that were most abundant, we had really large reductions. We repeated the experiment in the following year and we didn't see as strong of an effect. And basically what it boils down to is that when we look at fire, those were both sort of late summer, fall fires. And some of it was caused by a species that lays really shallow egg pods. And we did some experiments. We measured soil temperature, and you're getting direct mortality from elevating the temperature of the soil. With the other species that crashed following the fire, it was actually still in its egg laying phase, and the fire basically terminated reproduction. And a lot of the pest species that the migratory grasshopper in particular, the clear-winged grasshopper that are a big problem in your area, aren't really affected by fire because they lay, if the eggs are already in the ground, because the eggs are deep enough, as you can see here with the migratory grasshopper, that you don't really get an elevation in temperature. So obviously that's, as I say, an area that we're continuing to do some research in. We're doing a study in Mandan right now, looking at some fire in Mandan, North Dakota, fire and grazing treatments, also looking at how that affects dung beetle communities as well, and dung decomposition. So there's a lot we don't know, but as I say, we're trying to take a broad range of approaches and see if we can sort of add to the toolbox of managing grasshoppers. The website in Sydney, just once again, we have a range of information. There's an integrated pest management handbook, outbreak maps, species information. Go there. If you have questions, email me anytime. We're here. We'll try and help you out. So thanks.
Thanks, Dave. If folks have questions, they can type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself right now to ask Dave some questions. And if you think of it later on, he'll stick around for the next.
Yeah, I'll stick around, and you can always, when after Gary's, ask as well.
Okay. Great. All right, I will transition and introduce our second speaker. Give me one moment here. Okay. So our second speaker is Gary Adams. He is the State Plant Health Director of Montana with USDA, APHIS, and PPQ. And so Gary Adams is a native Montanan. He grew up near Columbus. He graduated from MSU with a degree in agronomy. And Gary has been working for the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Plant Protection and Quarantine since 1986. And he's been the State Plant Health Director since 2000, residing in Helena until 2015, and he currently resides in Billings. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Gary. Take it away.
Thanks, Kalina. So I've been having some significant technical difficulties. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
Yes, no? Coming in loud and clear.
I'm going to try to share my screen, so that'll be the next problem we have. It says it's connecting. Oh, now it's working. Is that working?
Looks good, Gary. We can see it.
Right on. 2 for 2. I actually disconnected from you guys twice while Dave was speaking, and it has nothing to do with Dave, but as far as you know, and then reconnected. So I'm going to try to move forward here so that we aren't here all night long. People probably got food to eat. But a little bit to let you know a little about who I am, so that you know where we're coming from, is that we consider the Ag Research Service, or Dave's group, the white collar workers or the thinkers, and we are the doers, or the blue collar workers within PPQ. But you may have heard of APHIS. I'm with the Plant Protection and Quarantine part of APHIS, but APHIS is a number of things that you may have dealt with in other scenarios. The Veterinary Services deals with foreign animal diseases like mad cow disease, foot and mouth disease, stuff like that, if it were to be introduced into the U.S. Your Wildlife Services is the government trappers, is what we call them here in Montana for the most part, but they do many things dealing with human and wildlife conflict. There are some other groups there, but I'm with the Plant Protection and Quarantine part of APHIS. And our mission really is to protect American agriculture and natural resources from invasive pests, and to make sure that our products are marketable to other countries. To paraphrase that a little bit, here's some examples of what we're not talking about today, but just to let you know where we're coming from. Most of the things that we deal with are things that are not supposed to be in the United States. That picture on the upper left is a picture of a disease that came in from other countries on geraniums, and that particular pathogen can be very devastating to our potatoes and tomatoes and other crops of that nature. The Asian longhorn beetle, the big beetle on the right, there's some beetles in Montana that look very similar to that, but that's very destructive to hardwoods and is established in the northeast part of the U.S., and they're trying to get rid of that. Massachusetts and New York could affect the cost of your syrup if it really gets embedded into the maple forest of the northeast. The bottom right is a disease of wheat that has been contained only to Arizona currently, and we survey for that with the Montana Department of Agriculture in Montana every year to make sure that Montana's grains, which some of you may be grain farmers, is still marketable, because 80% of our grain goes overseas, and we want to make sure that we demonstrate that we do not have some of these pests that are important. But we're not talking about any of that. We're going to talk about grasshoppers and marmot crickets, which are supposed to be here, like Dave said. They have been here for longer than we have, and that's a little bit of an anomaly for what APHIS deals with, but it is in our legislation to specifically deal with grasshoppers, marmot crickets. I'll explain that role here in a little bit. Why are we involved is that you think back in the Dust Bowl era, that an individual trying to suppress a large infestation of grasshoppers, it was just too difficult for one guy to walk along a fence line and to keep the grasshoppers from reinfesting their rangeland. This is actually a picture in Montana of a guy over on the, I believe, probably on the Flathead Reservation or Lake County, trying to stem a movement of Mormon crickets, which you guys may actually have some Mormon crickets in your area. I'd like to hear about it if you have experienced them. But as you can see, that's hard to manage large-scale infestations of rangeland pests. And so it was determined that the federal government might have a role in helping coordinate multiple landowners and doing some large-scale suppression treatments and to defer that cost a little bit, trying to keep the stewards of the land on the land. And I'll explain what our role is here in a little bit. So as far as grasshoppers and Mormon crickets, APHIS has three main roles. One, which Dave touched on quite a bit, is survey, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. We try to provide technical assistance specific to suppression, not range management like Dave touched on. That's why we're a sister agency. We kind of tag team some of this stuff. And then there are some suppression programs that we can be involved in, and we can, provide you the technical assistance for you to do it yourself, or we'll talk about whether or not our programs with the cost share and something called RATS, which we'll get into, might apply to your situation. We've not done much in Jefferson or Madison County in the past, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. So the surveys, there's several different surveys. Again, Dave touched on nymphal surveys, which means you have to get out there real early when they're hatching. They're about the size of a grain of rice, and it's really important, which I'll explain, for you to be looking at them when they're young and not be waiting until they're older. If they're the hot spots that Dave were talking about, if there's a small infestation, you want to see how broadly they're infesting your area in case you might be able to get a whole infestation and knock them back early. If you decide to treat, you want to count how many are there before you treat, and then again after you treat. And those big maps of the state is what Dave showed you, were the adult survey maps that we use to try to predict what's going to happen the following year. And again, Dave went over some of this stuff, talking about not all grasshopper species hatch all at the same time. You don't have to memorize any of this stuff, but just know that one species will hatch over an extended period of time. In other words, they don't all hatch at the same time. Not all species hatch at the same time. If you look here, this Nebraska grasshopper hatches real late in the year. That's predominantly a species farther east of where you guys are, but just know that one species, if you look out there one day towards the end of May and early June and you don't see them, that does not mean that 2 or 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later that you're not going to see a bunch. You got to keep watching. That's really the take-home message there. And Dave mentioned these overwintering species that you're not going to be concerned with. They'll actually hatch late, which is the yellow, and then they'll finish maturing the next spring, and we'll kind of ignore those. But just as a real quick overview of how you conduct a survey, this is pretty simple, not rocket science, is that you'll visualize a square foot ahead of you out on the rangeland. Think about a square foot in your kitchen tile on your floor, and walk towards that square foot and count how many grasshoppers jump out of that square. And if they jump in and jump out, it doesn't count. So write down that number on a piece of paper and then walk, several more steps out into your representative range and do that 18 times. So you're going to have 18 numbers that you'll total up, and that'll be the total number of grasshoppers in 18 square feet. Well, if you divide that by 2, you're going to get the number of grasshoppers in 9 square feet, which is the same as a yard, and that'll give you the number of grasshoppers per square yard. And that's the kind of the number that we go by when we start making management decisions. How many grasshoppers per yard or square meter? If you're with ARS, you're probably in the metrics, but it's not all that different, So the number of grasshoppers per yard is really what we're trying to look at. And what does that mean? So my colleague from Wyoming gave me the slide and says, what does a grasshopper eat? And it says a grasshopper can eat about its own weight or destroy up to 6 times its own weight of vegetation every day. Now that's a relative term. Different species do different things, but that word destroy as opposed to eat is that some grasshoppers, or many of the species of grasshoppers, may not even eat the vegetation. They may clip off portions of it and it falls to the ground, which is great for your organic matter, but it then no longer is available to the grasshopper or your cattle or whatever your management objectives are. So if you think about one grasshopper destroying up to 6 times its own weight every day, and you have between 20, 40, 50 grasshoppers per yard, that's a significant amount of forage. We have another table that we can provide that shows that if you have different densities of grasshoppers per yard, and whether you have them over 30, 45, 60 days, how much forage is lost during that course of time. That doesn't necessarily account for regrowth of vegetation, but it's a significant amount, and we can provide that to Colleen, and she can share it if there's a request for that. So do you treat? Do you suppress those grasshoppers? That's where we come in. You can look at some of these software sites. The University of Wyoming has this Karma that you can go in and you plug in your AUMs and some other factors to let it give you some decision-making information to help you make your decision. For the most part in Montana, it used to be that if there was 8 grasshoppers per yard or more, that we considered it competition for your livestock. Really, we suggest that treatments occur when you get into the teens. So if you get up into 15 grasshoppers per square yard, you're likely to want to consider treatments anyway. But what are your management objectives? Like Dave says, if there's no forage out there, maybe it's not in your best interest to spend a lot of money on grasshopper suppression. Maybe you want to just buy forage. So you have to consider whether treatments are the right decision or not based on a lot of factors. The density of grasshoppers is just one of those things. So do you want to do it by yourself? A lot of Montanans are independent. They do. USDA also has these programs, which we're going to talk about, and maybe we can help you. So let's talk about the control alternatives for PPQ. I will start this by saying that last year there was some landowners by Harrison, I believe, that call that's pretty close to your neighborhood. And we're talking about fire and burning, and it was kind of late in the year, so some of our treatment alternatives were not available to them, but we talked, and they did go do some treatments on their property with some other pesticides that are not available for PPQ, and they were able to suppress those grasshopper populations. So just keep in mind what I'm going to talk about is what's available to us, and know that if you talk to aerial contractors or something, there might be some pesticides outside what I'm talking about today that are available to suppress grasshoppers. But one thing that we can do is nothing. I know there's probably some government jokers out there saying, yeah, we know how you are. You're going to do nothing. I'll explain that. We might treat with conventional rates over an entire area, which we used to do, and we don't much anymore. And I'm going to talk a little bit in detail about the reduced agent area treatments, or RATs alternative. And that's a method that we use pretty much exclusively for treating rangeland grasshoppers anymore. And it reduces cost and is a little more favorable for the environment. But we'll get into that a little bit. No action. Why would we do nothing? Well, we certainly wouldn't do anything if you don't ask us to. That's number one. Number two, if you ask us to, but there isn't economic levels of grasshoppers, we would still do nothing. Environmental factors, a lot of water in the area, a lot of things that pesticide and aerial application are not, don't go hand in hand. We've had to turn down places over in Lake County again, where there's a lot of water and it just wouldn't be effective to do large aerial treatments. Endangered species have not been a significant issue for Montana, but we always consider them. Those kinds of things. That might be why we wouldn't do anything. The pesticides that we have available to us are listed there. Malathion, carbaryl, which you often would see in Lowe's or Home Depot or at your local hardware store, is 7. And diflubenzuron, which we'll talk about, is our tool of choice now. Dimilin is the common brand name, but there's other brands. We don't want to promote just one brand. And then chlorantraniloprol, which will be on the quiz later when Colleen asks you to pronounce the things that we're talking about, or Previthon is a little easier to say, we thought was going to be available to us, and it is not, and I'll explain that a little bit. Malathion, the thing about malathion, again, it's really available. You can buy that anywhere. Anybody can buy it over the counter. If you want to do large scale treatments, of course, it wouldn't be just over the counter. You'd have to find a dealer for that. But it only lasts 3 to 5 days out there. It's a quick knockdown. It'll kill grasshoppers quickly, but the whole reason that it kills them quickly is because it's a cholinesterase inhibitor or affects their nervous system. So anything with the nervous system, based on the rate, could have be impacted by mouth ion. So it's not all that friendly to pollinators like bees or butterflies, that kind of thing. It's effective on contact or ingestion, but it's fairly reasonable cost, and it's available and goes away after 3 to 5 days. So that can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, which I'll explain. Carbaryl, or as I mentioned, the common brand is 7. There's other carbaryls out there, just be aware of that. It does last a little bit longer, 10 days for sure, maybe 2 weeks. It's also a nerve inhibitor, also effective whether the grasshopper eats it or if it comes in contact. So it's available. And the other thing about carbaryl is that you can mix it with bait or buy it in a bait formulation, and there are applications for that, which we will talk about. And Dave did mention some different species, which may or may not have meant anything to you when he said it, but I will explain why it is important to know what species you have. The thing about carbaryl bait is that it costs $1 to $2 a pound, and the rate for rangeland is 10 pounds per acre. So if you, I'm just putting this in here saying that if you buy it at the high end and you're applying quite a bit of it, it could be $20 an acre before you even figure in your application costs. So cost is kind of an issue with some of the brand. But diflubenzuron, this is the tool that we have used almost exclusively in Montana and throughout the West, actually, because we have programs all the way to Arizona. And remember, Dave was talking about the life cycle of grasshoppers, and they go from one life stage to another by shedding their exoskeleton, puffing up their body and getting a little bigger, and then getting, their exoskeleton hard again. Well, the mode of action with diflubenzuron is that it's a chitin inhibitor, and chitin is the substance that makes their exoskeleton hard. And so when they go from one life stage to another, they simply just do not form their exoskeleton again, and they slowly die off. It sounds a little mean, I suppose, but anything that does not have chitin in it is basically not affected by diflubenzuron. So it's arthropod, which is basically anything with an exoskeleton specific. I put in here this bee-friendly. Pollinators prefer that we use diflubenzuron. A lot of beekeepers will say, "Go ahead and spray right over my beehive." They're not concerned with it. My personal management strategy is that we will not spray beehives directly with diflubenzuron because I just think it's a bad idea. But I know others that do, and the beekeepers say, "We're not concerned. Go for it." So my point here is that pollinators are an important part of our world as we know it today, and diflubenzuron is very friendly towards bees. The challenge is that, again, you have to treat them before they're adults. If you treat when they're adults, they're not going to shed their exoskeleton at that point in time, and it's not an effective tool for suppressing that year's population of grasshoppers. There is some story that if you spray the adult stage, that the eggs do not hatch the following year, but even the pesticide company is still trying to decide whether or not they want to promote it for that purpose. But it will not necessarily kill the grasshoppers for that year. So if you're trying to save this year's forage, treating adult grasshoppers, you would not want to use diflubenzuron. Again, it costs quite a bit, but you don't use very much per acre. We'll get into that though. And then chlorantraniliprole is another fairly environmentally safe pesticide that we're hoping will be available in the future. Right now, they're working on the amount of rates, the gallons of water that you have to use to carry it onto the rangeland is a little cost prohibitive. They didn't get the pesticide labeled this last year. We have considered it in our environmental impact statement, but it's not labeled. We're still working out how to get it so it's affordable on rangeland rates, and basically it just keeps the grasshopper, it makes them quit eating, and that's and you can use it when they're adults. That's the thing, is that it'll work on nymphs and adults. So we're excited that this may be a tool when diflubenzuron loses its window of opportunity, that will have something other than a nerve inhibitor to use over a broad scale. But it's not available yet. So what I've done is provided this presentation to Kalina. If you want to copy she could provide that to you, so you don't have to write any of this down. But for malathion, you only put 8 fluid ounces over an entire acre. It's very low. There's no carrier. It's all just the technical material of malathion, just 8 ounces over an acre. Carbaryl, you would use 16 fluid ounces of an acre. You would carry that on with a mixture of water. 10 pounds of an acre, like I said, of the bait. These are the conventional rates. With diflubenzuron, it's 1 ounce per acre, and you carry that on with water and oil mixture, which I'll show you a slide here in a little bit on what we're recommending for that. In the 1980s, again, I don't know that we did any work in your area, but we did large areas with these large plains, and we wanted to make sure that we got every grasshopper that was out there, not being maybe as conscious as we should have been. Here's some old pictures, these giant aircraft that we use and the barrels of malathion. But in the 2000s, we kind of turned a corner and thought that we need to be a little bit environmentally sound. We can use smaller planes. The new GPS and guidance system allow us to not have to fly planes in tandem. We can put the maps in an aircraft, tell them where the sensitive sites are to shut off, and they can go out and apply all with the electronic guidance system. You'll notice here that these planes are flying higher than what you typically picture a crop duster, that you call them dragging their wheels on the top of the crop, and that's intentional. They fly about 1.5 wings up off the ground. These larger turbine thrushes have 150-foot swath, and when we talk about the rats approach, we don't even treat the whole thing. So it's a little bit different than treating a crop. This is all rangeland application that I'm talking about here, so keep that in mind. The reduced agent area treatments is basically, if you want to just pare it down to simplicity, it's basically you're skipping every other swath. So you're not treating the entire area. You know that grasshoppers are alive. They're not like a weed or a plant where if the pesticide doesn't touch it, it's not going to affect the plant. Grasshoppers will move, and they move throughout the environment on a regular basis, and they will eventually move into a treated swath. So if you get out the Dimilin out there early enough and know that it's going to be out there for about 4 weeks, they will eventually move in there, and you will suppress 90% of that population of grasshoppers without treating the entire area. And at the same time, non-target insects will continue to survive and feed on the grasshoppers, and birds and predators will continue to feed on them, and it's kind of a win-win for all, quite honestly. So here's an example. If you picture the plane flying away from you, and this green line is how much pesticide is being applied. There's less on the ends. Traditionally, we would try to overlap the ends of the swath so that there was the same amount of pesticide throughout the whole area. With rats, we intentionally leave places untreated completely. There's no pesticide applied there. So that's just a picture of that. Here's another picture of the same thing. We'll treat the red areas. We'll leave the gray areas completely untreated. Just an example. Again, with the reduced agent area treatments for rats, the amount that you skipped, it kind of depends on the chemical used. If you remember, malathion had a real low residual. It's only out there 3 to 5 days. So the grasshoppers only have 3 to 5 days to get from an untreated area into a treated area. So you'll want to skip less of the area. If you have carbaryl or diflubenzuron, you can use a wider skip because it's gonna be out there for a little while for them to get to it. So here's the typical amount of area that is recommended. With malathion, you would want to cover 80%, but with carbaryl and Dimilin, you can go about 50% of the entire area. And it's not standardized. You can adjust that based on your situation. So the reduced agent part of it is the formulation that's put out there. That other part was the reduced area part of rats. The reduced agent part of it is in certain circumstances, you may want to reduce the amount of pesticide actually applied where you are applying. So malathion was 8 ounces. It's cut in half to 4 ounces. Carbaryl went from 16 down to 8 ounces. With the bait formulation, that went from 5. You would still put out 10 pounds an acre because that's important, but you would go from 5% bait down to 2% bait. That's the amount of pesticide mixed in the bait. And then with diflubenzuron, you could reduce it from 1 ounce of an acre down to 3/4 of an ounce an acre. That'll save you a little bit of pesticide cost. But for the most part, throughout the West, we do a little bit of a modified rats, which means that we, at least with diflubendron, we keep the conventional rate, which is 1 ounce, instead of going down to 3/4, but we skip the swaths. So it's not a full rats, it's just putting the full rate of the 1 ounce per acre out, but only in half the area. So in Montana, always with PPQ's program, we've used this top formulation here. We've used 31 ounces total formulation an acre, which is the 1 ounce of diflubendron with 10 ounces of concentrated crop oil, and you can use vegetable oil too, and 20 ounces of water. So you got 31 ounces per acre that you're putting out there. The University of Wyoming and Wyoming PPQ in recent years has been using this 13 ounces of total formulation, which is still 1 ounce of diflubendron, but with less crop oil and water. And what that does is that lets the plane be in the air twice as long before they have to go back and fill up. And they have still seen, I think he told me today, 87 to 98% suppression of grasshopper populations with this rate. Now, I was questioning whether Wyoming has any vegetation down there and whether or not Montana decent rangeland would get the same impact. And he said that he did see that, good suppression in areas in Wyoming where they have grass. So I guess I'll have to believe him. We have kind of a little banter back and forth on the quality of the rangeland, Montana versus Wyoming. But in this coming year, because I expect a lot of treatments, and we're going to have to keep planes in the air. This is where we're going with this 13 ounces of total formulation. It also reduced the cost. Water doesn't cost anything, but the crop oil, it'll reduce that by half. And there isn't a significant amount of difference between the 1 ounce to 3/4 ounce diflubendron. So we're just going to stick with the ounce, make sure that it's still effective out there. Now, if you have areas that are smaller acres, you can use rats with ATVs and use these boom buster nozzles. So you don't have to have these big booms flopping around out there on the rangeland. It'll shoot it out to the side. You could protect maybe a quarter, maybe a half a section a day, not a lot. But if you apply rats, treating every other swath or even less, you can treat more. You might be able to treat 200, 400 acres a day. The bottom line is that if you want to treat 10,000 acre block, you're not going to be able to do it with an ATV, but it does make it attractive where you might want to suppress some grasshoppers on smaller acres. And that might apply to where you're got some rangeland adjacent to a crop that's being jeopardized by it, which I read about in some of Kalina's material, that was something that really happened, is that they moved off of the rangeland onto your crops. But here's what University of Wyoming recommended, and just read this bottom part down here. Whatever your percentage, whatever your grasshoppers per yard is, try to cover that much. So if you have 40 grasshoppers per yard, cover 40% of the acres. So you would leave 60% untreated. If you have, if you only have 20 grasshoppers per yard, you could probably, only cover 20% of the area. And as long as the grasshopper will move that 100 feet, you could just do a swath of pesticide, whatever the swath width is, even if it's with an ATV and it's less, as long as those grasshoppers are moving around, they will hit that treated area. So rats and alternate swathing or reduced swathing is an effective tool on the ground as well. So let's talk a little bit about bait and brand. I just like this old picture. I showed the old picture of the guy spraying arsenic with his blower. Here's an old, I think one of my former employees, actually, this was on her property out by Jordan, if I remember correctly. So there's some old tools. We've been spreading bait for a long time. Here's an old fire hazard, but we all have ATVs now, and there's a whirlybird, maybe a seed spreader or a fertilizer spreader. I don't know what you got, but something that's got a little whirlybird applicator on the back. You can use that to spread bait. We have these other things that have a big hopper, and you slide them in the back of the truck. They got a motor you start up, and it augers it into a blower and shoots it out to a pretty good swath, 40-foot swath, and we use that in certain places. There's different types of bait, different brands. There's a Wilbur Ellis example and an eco brand bait that's made in Canada, but just know that there's some that this is like a rolled bran here on the left, and this apple or grape pumice pellets on the right, and then they have these crumbles, which is smaller pellets. And the message here is that if you use these pellets in that blower, it kind of pulverizes it into dust, and then it makes it not really an effective application equipment for that type of product. So you want to make that you could with the whirlybird spreader, you could spread these pellets really easily, and it works really well. But it works bad in the blower. So make sure you're matching your equipment with the type of brand that you have. Again, at the end of the meeting, if someone just throws it in the chat or something, whether you have Mormon crickets, I'd like to hear about it. I know they're down in the Southwest. I know they've been in Beaverhead County, and you're right over the hill from there, but I'm not sure about Madison or Jefferson counties. But bran is the tool. That's the tool for crickets. Crickets are different. They act different. We're not going to get into it to a great extent, but if you have Mormon crickets, they get these bands when they're economically important, and they move in bands. And you can throw some bran out in front of that band. If you can get in front of them, the crickets don't fly. You can see they don't have any wings, and they pick up bran very readily. They eat stuff off the ground, and it's an effective tool with Mormon crickets. That is not necessarily the case for all grasshopper species. So Dave Branson's ARS website is the housing place for this grasshopper IPM project that was done years ago that identified what grasshopper species will eat bran. Well, there's a list of them. You're not going to know what they all are, but we did talk about, he talked about the clear-winged grasshopper. This is that Camnula pellucida one here, and the migratory grasshopper here. So they're on the list of things that will eat bran. I have not talked to too many. This is about the 14th one of these I've done. I've not talked to too many counties that have a lot of Camnula. You guys do. It is a great tool where you have Camnula. These other ones are marginal. You might get 70% mortality, is what they're saying. But it's a good tool for Camnula for whatever reason. They kind of get in bands and kind of walk before they're adults and feed off the ground. So it can be, if that's the pest you got, bran could.
Gary, we just lost your audio.
Material out on the ground, because these grasshoppers are not going to eat the bran. So the point there is you got to know. Huh? Am I back on? No. Taylor just came and said you couldn't hear me anymore. You guys good? Okay. All right. Well, I'm sure I said something really important there, but I don't know where I lost you, so I'll just keep going. I'm sure people are getting hungry. Anyway, well, I'm almost done actually, but just to go back a little bit here, we did all these surveys and to talk about Dave and the way the grasshoppers have changed their population over time. Dave already showed you these maps, but what I want to talk about is this is what we predicted for 18. This is what happened in 18, and we predicted for 19, so we weren't too far off. So we're predicting for 19. This is what really happened at 19, and we were predicting for 20. And this is what really happened in 20. So the predictive model is not perfect, but it kind of showed that there was a trend going on there. And Dave already showed you this slide. I stole that from him for my other PowerPoints. But the point is that if you think back to 19, just to beat home what Dave was saying, in 19 we had a really cold, wet spring, and we had a lot of forage, and the grasshoppers hatched late, and there was plenty of forage to go around between the grasshoppers and the forage. And going into that winter of 19 and 20, we had plenty of grasshoppers and nobody cared about them. And then we had a really, really mild winter, really mild, unseasonably mild. And then last year in 2020, every egg from all those grasshoppers from 19 survived. They all emerged in 2020. We had a droughty year, so nothing kicked them back with any kind of bad weather in 2020, and we had a huge grasshopper year. Here's a map that I had our GIS specialist put together of your area that showed where we did our surveys. It's just a roadside survey. We do try to focus on state and federal land just to stay off private land as much as we can. But we might hop a fence and look around and and drive down the road, but we don't share this with anybody. But the predominant species are, I'm getting dings, Dave. Am I losing you again? Oh, I'm back on. here's the species, and you don't know necessarily what these are, but this top one is the lesser migratory grasshopper. That's number one uno batto in Montana, and you got, out of all the samples that we took in your counties, this was numero uno. Number two was Chemnula pellucida, which is a clean wing grasshopper. That's number 2 or 3 worst grasshopper in the West. And then these other 2 are also on our top bad 12 list. These are the next 2 that were predominant species in your area. So not to be a downer, Debbie Downer, but you got the bad guys, and you can see the orange and the red dots throughout your area. There's plenty of color there. There's some, this is through the mountain. You see more moose in here than you see grasshoppers, but they could be up in there. But you can see where all the, here's where the guys were in Harrison. I guess that's right over in here, and they did some treatments there. They talked about wanting to burn the grasshoppers. I actually called Dave, and he talked to me about it's probably not the best tool, and then they treated with Lorsban, or I think Lorsban. Anyway, if you're on the call, you can tell us what your experiences was. I don't know that I recognized the name, but I know that there's grasshoppers, and I know that they required suppression in your areas. So you can see the colors. Anything that's orange or red had significant population. So we know you had some bad times there. So just real quick, we talked about the things we can do. The Plant Protection Act is the authority for APHIS to get involved. Real quick, the 2 programs that we have, in the event that you want more information, we should be talking sooner than later. The first one, which we have not dealt with in many years, is border treatments, which means that if you have private land that's adjacent to some federally administered land, could be, I guess it'd be BLM and Forest Service in your whole counties there, but probably more Forest Service, but I know there's some BLM over there. And that federal land managing agency asks us to, and you ask them to ask us to, we can treat, a buffer potentially on that federal land to keep grasshoppers from moving off of that onto land. If you're doing something on your side of the fence, this is a kind of a good neighbor thing for them to try to do some on the other side of the fence. The chance of us doing anything by ground is 0. I'm just going to tell you that right now. We don't have the infrastructure for it. And the chance of us getting an aerial contractor out to do small acres next year is not great. But if you think that this is a situation that's important to you, you need to contact us sooner than later. And I'm going to talk about funding. It's all contingent upon whether there's any money in. Currently there isn't, but we're working on that. But the bigger program that we've dealt with in Montana is that if there's large acres and individual landowner can't handle it themselves or choose not to, we kind of put this 10,000 acre minimum on there as a point by which the federal government would get involved. We can potentially help. And again, it's a rangeland program. We don't get involved in cropland, with the exception of if the 10,000 acres has cropland in it, we can include it. We don't cost share on it, which I'm going to talk about down here on the cropland portion of it. And you need to keep in mind that that crop has to be on the label for that pesticide, and keep advised that those rates that we apply are for shortgrass prairie or rangeland rates. They're not cropland rates. So you just have to be realistic in what your expectations are there. If there's federal or trust land, there's no reservations where you guys are, but if there's federal land there and that federal agency asks us to participate and APHIS has money, we pay for that. We pay for it. It wouldn't even, the Forest Service or BLM wouldn't pay for that. But they have to they have to ask us to do it, number one, and we have to have money. If there's state land involved, we will pay half of that, and you, as the lessee of the state land, would pay half. The DNRC does not have funding to pay their 50%. And on private land, the program was set up to have the private landowner pay a third, the state pay a third, and the feds pay a third. And again, Montana does not have funding for this. So 2/3 of that cost would go back to you, and APHIS pays the 1/3. And with any money that the government takes in, there's an indirect cost charge to that, and that's with anything that we bring in. But I'll give you some bottom line figures here in a minute. So, what's the, how does this all work? Number one, we don't do anything unless we're asked to. There's some cooperative agreements that have to be signed up front. It's kind of I can share those with you so you can see what they say if you want. If there's a group of you working together and one person is representing a group of people, we have an agreement that says that the funding should be put in an account so that somebody doesn't get stuck with other people's acres. We got to get maps together. We're already putting maps together of stuff that people are wanting suppressed last year, with including exclusions of any sensitive sites, the boundaries, different land ownerships. All that can be done now and should be done now. We want to plan early, and then we put out contracts, and we're trying to figure out how to get enough contractors to actually do the work, because it's looking like it could be a pretty big year next year. So what's it going to cost? The short answer is I don't know. But here's what I do know is that it's predominantly, here's what drives the cost. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself here. It depends on what the contractor bids. And I don't know, if there's more contractors, the bids are better. So we want some competition. The size of the block, if it's a larger block, they usually will charge less per gallon or per acre, because they are out there making money and not just spending time turning around. If there's a lot of forested areas or water or exclusions where they're turning off their nozzles, where anytime that they're not treating, their costs go up, and then the cost back to the landowners goes up. How far is it from an airport? Where's the water sources? Whether we use the 31 ounces or 13 ounces, all those things figure into what it's going to cost. But what I can tell you is that Taylor, who's on the call with us here today, she put together what we ended up charging back to landowners last year. We did about 400,000 acres, quite a lot actually. And for private land, it costs about $1.78 to $2.60, somewhere in there per acre of protected land. That don't worry about the rats. Anything within your boundary, that's what it costs to protect that rangeland. And there's no guarantees that those are the costs, but I think we would still be within that ballpark if there was a need to pull something together. It shouldn't ever cost over $3, and those that $2.60 was higher than most of our programs in recent years. So we got a lot of hoops to jump through. We have NEPA that we abide by, so any federal action has to assess its impact on the environment. The EAs are going to be going out for review soon. We're kind of waiting for BLM to give us some feedback to attach to those EAs, and then they're going out within the next week, or as soon as we get that information. We have the Endangered Species Act, where we consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service. That has not jeopardized any of our treatments, but we talk about buffers of the sensitive species, and they sometimes restrict us to only using diflubenzuron where there's a need. As a matter of fact, they let us use diflubenzuron where there's an endangered plant that's pollinated by wild bumblebees, and they let us use it. So there's some precedence that says that diflubenzuron is a good choice. So we do monitor the programs to make sure that we're not getting in the water. The quality control means we'll take samples of the mix, properly, and set it off to make sure that everything's going the way that it's supposed to be. You can do it yourself, but if you need us to do anything, we're looking at funding. And I submitted estimates for Montana at the end of the year, and then I updated it, I think, about a week ago. But this is the biggest year since I started in '86. We'll do the contracting. It's all dependent upon land ownership and how many applicators there are that are going to bid on it. So if you guys know any applicators in Montana that want to bid on this, tell them to call me, because we need to get people to do the work this coming year. And we already talked about NEPA and endangered species, but the thing is plan now. Don't wait. Here's a picture of what happened over by Hot Springs. there's all grasshoppers out in their hayfield. This is actually a hayfield, and this is what their hayfield ended up looking like. So don't let that happen. Even if, whatever. I guess it's your management objectives. If that's your objective, you can let it happen. Get out there early and check it out. I got a staff here. Hannah is another one. I don't have her contact information on here. We only have a handful of people for my agency, 5 total, and then an office manager. That's it, to do all the stuff that are not grasshopper related and grasshopper related. So the sooner you reach out to us for help if you want it, the better. And that's all I got. Stop there.
Gary, we have a question that came in. And this is a producer from the Whitehall area. And she said she had a terrible time on our hay ground last year with grasshoppers. And do you ever see people doing chemical through their pivots, or is that not as effective as an aerial application?
You were going to play a little video on crops from Kevin Warner, and I've heard people ask that question, but because pivots are not a rangeland thing, I don't have an answer for you. I've had people suggest that, but I don't know if it's effective. I think it could be, but I just don't know the answer.
Okay, we'll play the video and we'll get that question answered, Sarah, even if it's after tonight, and get you that information.
Yeah, Kevin Warner, who you're going to see the video on, deals with all the cropland issues, and he's not available, but we could reach out to him and try to find the answer to that, I guess. Anyway, go ahead.
Absolutely. Any other questions for Gary or Dave? And while I let folks think about it, I'm going to queue up our final piece. We have about 8 minutes of content. So our third speaker has a pre-recorded video. This is Kevin Warner. He's the cropland entomology specialist at MSU. He's not here with us tonight, but he recorded this. We wanted to add a little content on crops specifically, or cropland. And we can definitely, if there are any questions that come up during this video and this content piece that we can't answer, we can definitely get that information to you afterwards. So with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And if questions come up during this presentation that Dave or Gary can't answer, just because I can't see the chat box while I'm sharing, just interrupt me and I can pause it and we can address it immediately or at the end of the video, either one. So I'm just going to play the intro from Kevin and then skip to the part on crops. We'll also provide the link to this full video as well as the presentation slides from Gary and Dave afterwards for folks who are interested.
Kevin Warner. I'm an associate professor of entomology in the Department of Plant Sciences and Plant Pathology at Montana State University. Today I'm going to talk about grasshopper biology and grasshopper management in crops and rangeland.
And I'm just jumping to where we're going to start.
Of spot applications in those areas of concentrated grasshopper hatch. So May to June, you're out scouting for the juvenile nymphs. If it's crops, you're looking along the field edges. Also with crops, you want to take a look at the surrounding area. Grasshoppers tend to move in from surrounding grassland. So if your crops have a lot of surrounding grassland, you're probably going to have problems with grasshoppers continuing to migrate into your crop. July and August, you begin to look for adult migration. This can be a little more challenging because now they're flying and they can, appear suddenly. When they enter small grain fields, in addition to the feeding damage, they can also clip the wheat heads. And then later in August and September, you might start to look for egg-laying females and to scout for concentrated areas of egg-laying. This slide describes some economic treatment thresholds for small grains. This is information published on the High Plains IPM guide. And the thresholds are based upon the number of grasshoppers per square yard. And they kind of group the number of grasshoppers per square yards in categories. So, and also whether they're within the crop, within the field, crop field, or whether they're just around the outside of the field. So if they're not, so when they're inside the field, the threshold is lower. If they're only around the edges, the threshold is higher. So 0 to 2 grasshoppers per square yard in the field is considered not enough to cause economic damage in a small grain crop. Same with, say, 5 to 10 per square yard around the edge. But you have to start becoming concerned when they reach 3 to 7 per square yard within the field, 11 to 20 around the edge of the field per square yard. And you're probably going to be treating if they reach more than 8 per square yard within the field or more than 20 per square yard around the edge of the field. These would be treatment thresholds for things like spring wheat. When we start talking about winter wheat, you know, winter wheat is just emerging when these adult grasshoppers are large. So the number of grasshoppers that can cause economic damage is lower. So light populations may likely require treatment for winter wheat. I'm going to talk a little bit about managing grasshoppers in winter wheat. This can be challenging. When winter wheat, as I mentioned, when winter wheat is planted and it begins to emerge, most of the grasshopper populations are adults, so they're larger. They eat more. They have fully formed wings and they can fly, so they can appear suddenly. At this time of year, the grassland is drying up. And if the populations are high, there's not much food left, they're hungry. So then you can imagine when you get this nice, fresh, green winter wheat beginning to emerge in the middle of a dry, grassy area, that's very attractive to these grasshoppers. Adult grasshoppers are more difficult to kill because they're larger. So what do you do? How can you manage grasshoppers and protect your winter wheat? You can take a look at, you know, if you're surrounded by a grassy area, if you're able to manage grasshoppers in that rangeland area around your crop. There's a RATS program that I'll describe in a few slides, developed by the USDA for rangeland. When we're talking about protecting the winter wheat, we're talking about border treatments, sprays or seed treatments. So you kind of have a protective border for your winter wheat. In the case of a border spray, you can consider a border of up to 150 feet beyond the edge of the crop. If populations are very high and you're able to, depending on the land use, if you're able to go as far as 1/4 mile when populations are very high to create this buffer, this border. When you're using a spray to create a protective border of an insecticide, timing is critical. So these border sprays need to be applied just before the winter wheat emerges. If you apply too early, you know, these sprays maybe have a 7 to 10 days residual. Dimlin has a really good residual, but these other insecticides will not have a 1 month residual like Dimlin does. So if you spray too early around the edge of your winter wheat, you're not going to get persistence of that spray if you spray too early. Now, of course, if you come in and you spray too late, so your winter wheat has emerged already, the grasshoppers have flown in, and they've caused a lot of damage if you get in there too late with your border treatment. So a lot of producers that I've talked to are pretty happy with a seed treatment as a border. So instead of putting down an insecticide spray around your winter wheat field, you do 1 or 2 passes of a high rate of something like gaucho around the edge of your winter wheat field, 1 or 2 passes. What's nice about using a seed treatment is timing is no longer an issue, right? Because those seed treatments are systemic. They're put on the seed, you plant it, and that insecticide is translocating to the developing wheat seedling. You will get some damage because it's a systemic insecticide. So the grasshoppers are going to get to the edge of your winter wheat and start eating it before they have the before they get the toxic effect. But if the populations aren't too high, then that winter wheat usually recovers quite well. Anytime you're trying to control adult grasshoppers, you need to go with the higher end of the label rate. You can't try and go with a half rate. They're difficult to kill, so you go with the higher end of the label rate. And when grasshopper populations are extreme, it's just very difficult to control them and prevent damage. Multiple treatments may be required. I've talked to producers that farmed in the mid-1980s, and one producer told me, he sprayed his wheat crop 3 times, and he still lost the entire crop to the grasshoppers after spraying 3 times. And I asked him, well, what was surrounding your crop? And he said it was CRP. So there was a lot of grassy area from which those grasshoppers just kept on migrating into his wheat crop. So now I'll discuss.
Okay, that's the end of the crop section. And I'll stop sharing my screen, and if folks have questions, please pop them into the chat or unmute yourself. And before we close up, I'm just going to drop a couple things into the chat box. So we do have a survey. If folks want to type in their email, we'll make sure to save that and follow up with copies of the presentations. And we can also send a copy of this video and the other videos we have. Yeah, any other questions? Folks have a lot of really good information tonight from all our speakers, so we really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise. Okay, I'm dropping that evaluation link in the chat, and if folks can take that, that'll help us with feedback and info. And we have another Rancher Roundtable in 2 weeks from today. So we'll stick around for just another minute or two, see if folks have any questions. Grasshopper season will be here before we know it, despite the weather in the last week or so. Thanks again, Gary and Dave, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Hey, Kalina, I've got a question for Gary, I think.
Go ahead, Nick.
Gary, you had a map there on an outbreak forecast for the past couple of years. Is there a link that's available for that?
Yeah, I have. There's a link for the current forecast. I don't know if they archive all the past year's ones. If you need them, I can send them to you. But do you want to just know the current map, or what's all do you want?
Yeah, just the current map for what the forecast is, and is it updated as the year goes or progresses on along, based off of weather and everything else?
And probably not on the website. We have started collecting data on iPads and downloading them daily so that we can monitor things on a real-time or as close to real-time basis, but that isn't really displayed in any public place. But if anybody wants to ask, we can, you can ask us. But we're gonna probably focus our surveys on where we expect to do some suppression treatments in the spring. So we won't be looking across the state really for any real-time survey data, I don't think. unless there's some projected treatments in that area. The only time that we hit that statewide is when we do the adult surveys, which happens between July and mid-July till maybe the end of August when they're laying their eggs and they're all adults. Other than that, we're not everywhere, and we're certainly not everywhere then either. But I don't know that I'm really giving you what you want there. And what can I do to help?
No, that answered my question there. Just contact you if there's any treatment process that's going on in our area.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I've been at it for 33 years in Montana, and we've never treated in Madison or Jefferson counties. So we haven't, but that doesn't mean anything, because there's a number of counties that are asking us to treat in 2021 that we've never done work in. So that could still happen. But right now we have no requests for any activity in your area at this point in time. So earlier, if somebody thinks that there's a reason to get involved, we need to talk about that earlier than later. But right now there's nothing.
Thanks. Good question, Nick. Any other questions? Well, thanks again. Appreciate your time, Gary and Dave. Great information, and we look forward to sharing it with folks after tonight too, as questions will come up in the spring and early summer, I'm sure.
Okay. Yep. Thank you for putting it together and putting up with my technical difficulties.
Yeah, thanks, Kalina.
Yeah. Have a good rest of the night, everyone, and stay warm.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.